She disappeared after her sister's funeral, carrying a secret love she could never confess. Now, years later, she's back standing at his door with nothing but a newspaper clipping and a heart full of regret. Inside, a baby cries inconsolably, and a broken man struggles alone. But when she takes the child in her arms, something magical happens. Silence. The town will call it scandalous. They'll say she's destroying his reputation, but sometimes love doesn't follow the rules. If you're enjoying this story, smash that like button. Hit subscribe for more emotional tales, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from right now. The wailing cut through the Wyoming morning like wind through canyon walls, relentless, hollow, desperate. Clare stood at the weathered gate, her calloused fingers wrapped around iron bars, worn smooth by decades of hands that belonged to this place more than hers ever would. The metal was cold beneath her palms, carrying the chill of mountain air and the weight of early autumn frost that clung to everything like unspoken regret. Behind the sound of the crying child, she could hear him moving through the house, his footsteps heavy and uneven, carrying the weight of 3 weeks without sleep. The rhythm was erratic, quick steps followed by pauses, the sound of a man trying to calm something that couldn't be calmed, trying to fix something that seemed fundamentally broken. Each pause stretched longer than the last, filled with the kind of silence that spoke of exhaustion so complete it had become its own form of desperation. The baby's cries pulled at something deep in her chest, a recognition that bypassed thought and went straight to bone. She had heard that sound before, in the space between memory and dream where Lia's voice still lived, where her sister's laughter echoed in rooms Clare would never visit again. This was Lia's daughter, the child she had never seen but had carried in her heart since the telegram arrived in Denver 6 months ago. Its words sparse and final, "Lia gone. Come if you can." She hadn't come then. Fear had roots deeper than grief, and shame grew faster than courage. The train ticket had remained unused in her bureau drawer, a daily reminder of all the ways she had failed to be the sister Lia deserved. But now, standing before the house where Lia had built her life, a life Clare had observed from careful distance, she understood that some arrivals couldn't be delayed forever, no matter how much they cost. The house itself seemed to sag under the weight of sorrow. Its white paint faded to the color of old bones. The wraparound porch that had once been Lia's pride, now cluttered with the detritus of a man trying to manage alone. A baby carriage sat abandoned near the steps, its wheels thick with dust. Tiny clothes hung motionless on a line, too small to catch the wind, looking lost against the vast Wyoming sky. The door hung slightly ajar, as if the house itself was too tired to close properly. Through the gap she glimpsed movement, a man's figure passing like a shadow, the baby's cries rising and falling with his proximity. Coulter, she remembered, him from before, though the years between then and now felt like looking through water, all the edges blurred by time and distance, and the particular pain of loving someone you could never have. Her hand found the brass compass that hung at her throat, Lia's last gift, given on a day when they had both believed in different futures. The metal was warm against her palm, holding the heat of her skin and something else. Possibility, perhaps, or simply the need to move forward when standing still became unbearable. The compass had been their grandmother's, passed down through generations of women who had found their way through landscapes, both literal and metaphorical. Lia had pressed it into Clare's hands the day before her wedding, her eyes bright with happiness and something that might have been understanding. For when you need to find your way home, she had said, and Clare had wondered even then if Lia knew how far she would have to travel, how many wrong paths she would take before she understood what home meant. The gate opened with a sound like sighing, metal hinges protesting the movement after months of disuse. Claire's feet knew the path without conscious direction, muscle memory guiding her up the gravel drive that crunched beneath her boots like broken promises. Each step brought the crying closer, brought her deeper into a world she had abandoned when staying became too painful to bear. The morning light was thin, filtered through clouds that promised snow before nightfall. It cast everything in shades of grey and silver, making the landscape look like a Duret type from her childhood, beautiful and distant and somehow unreal. But the sound of the baby's distress was immediate, visceral, impossible to ignore or aestheticize. It demanded response, demanded presence, demanded the kind of courage Clare had spent years avoiding. She paused at the bottom of the porch steps, listening to the sounds from within the house. The baby's cries had shifted, become more urgent, more desperate. Underneath them, she could hear Coulter's voice, rough with exhaustion, trying words. That had no power against infant despair. "Shh, Matty, please, sweetheart. Please stop crying." The raw pain in his voice cut through Clare's careful defenses, reminding her that grief was a country everyone had to navigate alone. Even when they lived in the same house, even when they shared the same loss, she thought of Lyre, who had written letters full of joy about this pregnancy, about the child who would carry forward all their hopes for the future. She thought of how her sister would feel, knowing her husband and daughter were struggling, while Clare stood frozen at the threshold, paralyzed by her own complicated history. The compass grew warmer against her skin, as if responding to her need for direction. Clare closed her eyes, feeling the weight of all her unfinished business with this place, with these people, with the woman she had been before loss taught her how to run. When she opened them again, the path forward seemed clearer, even if it led toward everything she had spent years trying to avoid. He appeared in the doorway before she reached it, as if summoned by her presence rather than her footsteps. Coulter looked as though he had been carved from exhaustion. His dark hair disheveled and longer than she remembered, stree with premature, grey that spoke of grief's accelerated aging. His shirt was wrinkled and stained with what looked like milk and tears, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with the lean muscle of a man who worked with his hands. His eyes carried the particular emptiness that comes from trying to fill a space too vast for any one person, the hollow look of someone who had forgotten how to sleep. The baby in his arms had quieted to soft hiccups, but her small fists moved constantly, reaching for something that wasn't there. She was larger than Clare had expected, no longer the newborn of her imagination, but a child of several months with the kind of alert awareness that spoke of intelligence beginning to unfold. Her hair was dark like her father's, but the shape of her face, the delicate curve of her nose, that was pure Leia. Clare felt her breath catch as memory and present moment collided with unexpected force. The child wore a yellow dress that had been carefully made, probably by Lyre's hands during the long months of waiting. The fabric was soft cotton, printed with tiny white flowers, and Clare could imagine her sister choosing it, imagining the daughter who would wear it. Now it hung slightly loose on Matty's small frame, as if she hadn't been eating quite enough. Hadn't been thriving in the way babies needed to thrive. Clare. His voice was rough, uncertain. He said her name like a question, as if he couldn't quite believe the answer. The sound of it on his lips brought back memories she had worked hard to bury. Summer evenings on this same porch, the three of them talking until the stars came out. The careful way he had always maintained distance between them, while Leah laughed and planned their future. "I saw your notice." She held up the newspaper clipping, its edges soft from folding and unfolding. The paper was from the Wyoming Territory Herald, and his advertisement had been brief, almost desperate in its simplicity. Help needed caring for infant. References required inquire at Heart Ranch. She had read it 17 times during the train. Journey from Denver. memorizing the words until they became a kind of prayer. They stood facing each other across the threshold, the space between them charged with everything unspoken. She could see him trying to decide whether to step aside or close the door, his body tense with indecision that spoke of a man who had learned to be careful with hope. The baby made a small sound, and his attention shifted immediately, his arms automatically adjusting to support her better. The movement was practiced now, natural in a way that spoke of weeks spent learning her rhythms, her needs, her particular language of comfort and distress. "She won't stop," he said, and the words carried more than their surface meaning. They carried weeks of desperation, nights spent walking the floor while dawn approached with pitiless regularity, the growing fear that he was failing at the most important task of his life. "I've tried everything, feeding, rocking, singing. Mrs. Patterson came by last week with advice about schedules and discipline, but nothing works. She just cries." Clare stepped closer, close enough to see the fine lines around his eyes, the way his hands shook slightly with fatigue, close enough to catch the scent of him, soap and wood smoke, and something indefinably masculine that made her conscious of her own bare ring finger, her own careful isolation. From this kind of domestic intimacy. "May I?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to name. In it was everything they had never said to each other, all the careful distance they had maintained when Lyre was alive, all the guilt that had driven Clare away and kept her away. She could see him weighing possibilities, the risk of letting her close against the desperate need for help, the complicated history between them against the immediate reality of a child who wouldn't be comforted. His hesitation was visible, a flicker of something, doubt, fear, or perhaps just the protective instinct of a parent who had already lost too much. She watched him look at her face, searching for something she wasn't sure she could provide. Trust, perhaps, or simply the promise that she wouldn't disappear again when things became difficult. The baby began to cry again, the sound cutting through their careful negotiations with the authority of genuine need. Matty's face screwed up with the effort of her distress, her small body rigid with an anguish that seemed too large for such a tiny person to contain. The sound was raw, desperate, the kind of crying that spoke of needs that went deeper than hunger or comfort. The need for connection, for recognition, for the particular safety that came from being known and loved. But then something shifted, in Coulter's expression, some internal barrier giving way under the weight of necessity. "Yes," he said simply, "please." The transfer happened slowly, carefully, as if the child were made of spun glass rather than flesh and bone. Clare felt the weight of her, substantial and real, warm and alive, and something inside her chest unclenched for the first time in months. Matty was heavier than she had expected, solid in the way of healthy babies. But there was something fragile about her too, something that spoke of a spirit not quite settled in the world. "Hello, sweet one," she whispered, and her voice carried notes she hadn't known were there. Maternal notes, protective notes, the kind of tenderness she had trained herself not to feel. "Hello, Matty." The name felt strange on her tongue, unfamiliar, in a way that spoke of missed months, missed opportunities to be present for this child's arrival in the world. Lyre had chosen it, written it in careful script in the letter that had arrived 2 months before the telegram. "We're calling her Matty, after Mama's middle name. I wanted to tell you first before anyone else knows. She's moving so much now. I think she's going to be a dancer like you were." Clare had never answered that letter, another regret in a collection that seemed to grow despite her efforts to lighten it. But the baby responded to her voice immediately, her cries softening to whimpers, then to the kind of hiccuping silence that meant tears were ending. Clare began to rock, a motion that came from instinct rather than experience, and felt Matty's body relax against her chest. The child's breathing deepened, her small fist closing around Clare's finger with surprising strength. The grip was firm, possessive, as if she had been waiting for exactly this moment, exactly this person. Clare looked down at the small face now peaceful against her shoulder and felt something fundamental shift inside her. This was Lyra's daughter, but she was also herself, unique, irreplaceable, carrying forward something precious into a world that had seemed diminished by her mother's absence. Her eyelashes were impossibly long, dark crescent against cheeks that still held the softness of early infancy. Her breathing was even now, the desperate edge of distress fading into something that looked almost like contentment. "How did you?" Coulter's voice trailed off, wonder replacing exhaustion in his tone. He was staring at them both as if witnessing something he couldn't quite believe, his hands hanging loose at his sides like a man who had forgotten what to do with them now that they weren't needed for holding and rocking and trying to provide comfort. Clare didn't answer immediately. She was listening to something beyond words, the rhythm of the baby's heartbeat, the subtle shift in the air that meant trust was being offered tentatively, like a wild creature approaching an outstretched hand. There was something in the way Matty settled against her that spoke of recognition deeper than familiarity, older than memory, blood calling to blood perhaps, or simply the mysterious affinity that sometimes existed between souls who needed each other. "She knows," Clare said finally, her voice soft with amazement. "Blood calls to blood." It was true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was more complicated, woven from threads of longing and loss that she wasn't ready to examine in the harsh light of day. The whole truth was that holding this child felt like coming home to a place she had never been, like completing a story she hadn't known she was writing. Matty stirred slightly, making the small sounds babies make when they are settling into sleep. Her hand had found Clare's collar and was gripping it with the kind of possessive trust that children reserve for those they consider safe. The gesture was so natural, so immediate, that Clare felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "You can't stay," Coulter said, but his voice lacked conviction. He was watching the way the baby curved into Clare's embrace, the way her small body had found its resting place against her aunt's shoulder. It was impossible to deny the rightness of it, the way they fit together like pieces of a puzzle that had been separated too long. "No," Clare agreed, though she made no move to hand the baby back. "I can't." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with all the reasons she had stayed away, all the complications that made her presence here problematic. She was a single woman with no permanent address, no steady income, no conventional credentials for raising a child. She was the sister who had disappeared when things became difficult, who had built a life around avoiding exactly this kind of responsibility. She was the woman who had loved her sister's husband from a distance, who had carried that secret like a burden for years. Yet neither of them moved to change what was happening in that moment. The child peaceful at last, the house settling into a quality of quiet it hadn't known in weeks, the afternoon light slanting through windows that had been dark for too long. There was something fragile about the scene, something that felt like it might shatter if examined too closely, but also something undeniably right. Clare shifted her weight slightly, unconsciously swaying in the rhythm she had seen mothers used since time immemorial. Matty sighed in her sleep, a sound of pure contentment that seemed to fill the space between them with possibility. For just this moment, in the threshold between past and future, they were simply what they appeared to be, two people caring for a child who needed them both. The house remembered Lyra in ways that made Clare's chest tight with grief, and something more, complicated than mere sorrow. Her sister's touch was everywhere. In the careful arrangement of wildflowers in a mason jar on the kitchen windowsill, now dried to whispered shadows of their former selves. In the way curtains were hung to catch the morning light just so, creating patterns of gold and amber that moved across the wooden floors like living things. In the quilt folded at the foot of the bed, where Coulter now slept alone, its blues and greens worked in the pattern their grandmother had taught them both, which only Lyra had ever mastered. Clare had agreed to stay until Coulter found other help, a temporary arrangement that felt both necessary and dangerous in ways she couldn't quite articulate. The agreement was spoken in practical terms, room and board in exchange for childcare, a business arrangement that might satisfy the town's expectations of propriety. But underneath the practical language lay currents that neither of them was ready to name, depths that made the surface negotiations feel like dancing on thin ice. She had taken the small room off the kitchen, the one Lyra had used for sewing, when the light was good and her hands were steady. The space still held the ghost of lavender sachets and the faint sound of her sister's humming melody lines that seemed to linger in the corners where sunlight didn't reach. Clare's few belongings looked lost in the room. A traveling bag, a handful of books, the worn shawl that had been their mother's, evidence of a life lived in temporary places, always ready to move on when staying became too complicated. But the baby's needs created a rhythm that began to organize, their days with a logic more compelling than social convention, feedings every few hours, changings that required careful attention to small details, the careful dance of exhausted caregivers passing responsibility between them like a torch that could never be allowed to go out. Clare found herself moving through the house with increasing familiarity, her hands learning where things belonged, her body adapting to the particular demands of caring for someone so small and so completely dependent. The kitchen became their command center, where bottles were warmed and tiny clothes were washed and dried, where they took turns drinking coffee that was always slightly cold because Matty's needs took precedence over everything else. Clare learned to navigate around Coulter's habits. The way he needed his first cup of coffee before he could manage conversation, the way he automatically checked the weather each morning as if planning work that was now secondary to childcare. The way he moved through familiar spaces with the unconscious grace of someone who had lived in the same place for years. But Coulter watched her with a weariness that spoke of deeper currents, old wounds that hadn't quite healed, despite the years between then and now. She would catch him looking at her when he thought she wasn't aware, his expression unreadable. Sometimes she wondered if he saw Leia in her movements, if the resemblance between sisters was comfort or torment. They had the same hands, the same way of tilting their heads when they were thinking, the same laugh, though Clare's had grown rusty from disuse. "You're good with her," he said on the third evening, as Clare settled Matty for sleep in the cradle that had been hastily moved into the kitchen, where they could both hear her if she woke. The cradle was beautifully made, carved from cherry, wood with a smoothness that spoke of loving hands and patient hours. Lyra had mentioned it in one of her letters, how Coulter had worked on it through the long winter months, preparing for the child who would make their family complete. "She's easy to love," Clare replied. Though the words came out more vulnerable than she'd intended, she was acutely aware of how she must look to him, hair escaping from its pins after a long day, her dress wrinkled and marked with the evidence of childcare, her face probably showing more emotion than was entirely proper for someone who was supposed to be merely hired help. He was quiet for a long moment, standing in the doorway with his hands shoved deep in his pockets, watching the gentle rise and fall of Matty's breathing. The evening light was soft, forgiving, making the kitchen feel like a sanctuary separate from the rest of the world. Leah always said, "You had a gift with children." The mention of her sister's name hung in the air between them, like something fragile and precious. They had been careful these first few days to avoid the territory of memory too directly. The present moment was complicated enough without adding the weight of everything that had come before, but grief had its own timetable, and some conversations couldn't be postponed forever. She talked about me. The question slipped out before Clare could stop it, carrying more longing than she wanted to reveal. She had always wondered what Lyra said about her during the years of their separation, whether her sister spoke of her with disappointment or understanding or simple resignation. Often his voice was soft, careful, as if he understood the importance of his words, especially toward the end when she was worried about what would happen to Matty if something went wrong. Clare's hand stilled on the baby's blanket, her heart suddenly beating too fast. What did she say? But Coulter had already turned away, leaving her alone with Matty's peaceful breathing and the weight of everything she would never know. The kitchen fell into the particular quiet of evening when the day's work was done, but sleep still felt distant. Clare sat beside the cradle, listening to the small sounds of a child at rest, and wondered what dreams visited someone so new to the world. What hopes and fears might already be taking root in a mind just beginning to understand its place in the complicated business of living. The town's judgment arrived like morning frost, inevitable, covering everything with a chill that made even familiar places feel unwelcoming. Clare felt it in the way conversations stopped when she entered Miller's general store. Words cut off mid-sentence as if her presence had the power to steal voices. She felt it in the careful distance people, maintained at the post office, the way they stepped aside to avoid accidental contact, as if her unconventional situation might be contagious. Most of all, she felt it in the pointed looks that followed her down Main Street like invisible weights, making her spine straightened with defensive pride, even as her heart contracted with old, familiar pain. "That's the Alcott girl," she heard Mrs. Henderson whisper to her companion as they passed near the church steps. "The strange one, running around wild all those years. No husband, no home, no decent prospects. Now she's back, moving in on her. Dead sister's family, like she has some right to be there." Clare kept walking, her spine straight, her face arranged in an expression of calm dignity that had taken years to perfect. She had learned long ago that showing pain only gave small people more ammunition, that the best defense against gossip was the appearance of complete indifference. But the words found their mark anyway, burrowing under her skin where they would ache in quiet moments, joining the collection of similar judgments she had been accumulating since she was old enough to understand that her choices marked her as different, difficult, dangerous to the social order that kept small towns functioning. The worst part was not the cruelty of the comments, but their fundamental accuracy. She had run wild in the town's estimation. She had remained unmarried past the age when such things were considered natural and proper. She had wandered from place to place without putting down roots, earning her living in ways that seemed suspicious to people who believed women should exist only in relation to the men who claimed them. And now she was living in Coulter's house, caring for his child, occupying a space that should rightfully belong to a wife. At the Mercantile, she placed her order with deliberate politeness, her voice carefully modulated to give no offense, while also requiring no special friendliness. "Flour, salt, coffee beans, and if you have any of that lavender soap, Mrs. Miller." The shopkeeper's wife nodded briskly, her movements efficient but cold. She was a woman who prided herself on knowing everyone's business and having opinions about all of it. Opinions that she shared freely, whether they were requested or not. "Heard you're helping Coulter with the baby." "I am." Clare kept her answers short, offering no additional information that might be twisted into something scandalous. "Temporary, I hope." Mrs. Miller's tone suggested that hope was perhaps too weak a word for what she felt. Man like that needs a proper wife. Not, she gestured vaguely, as if Clare's very existence was something distasteful that required no specific description. Not what, Mrs. Miller? Clare's voice remained level, but underneath the calm surface, anger was beginning to build like pressure. In a kettle, the woman's cheeks flushed with the particular righteousness of someone who believes their prejudices are moral imperatives. Well, you know what people say about women who live the way you have, wandering about. No family ties, no decent prospects. It's not natural for a woman to be so independent. And now, living in that house, taking care of that baby like you're some kind of substitute mother. It's just not right. Clare felt the familiar weight settle on her shoulders, the judgment of women who had never stepped outside the narrow paths laid out for them by fathers and husbands and society, who couldn't imagine wanting anything beyond what they had been told to want. Women who saw her freedom as a reproach to their own choices, her independence as a criticism of their dependence. Perhaps, she said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of steel that made Mrs. Miller stepped back slightly. You might concern yourself with your own life and leave others to manage theirs as they see fit. She left with her supplies and her dignity intact, but the encounter stayed with her like the taste of something bitter. The walk back to the ranch felt longer than usual. The familiar landscape somehow changed by the weight of carrying other people's disapproval. In the safety of Coulter's kitchen, with Matty sleeping peacefully in her cradle, and the afternoon light streaming through windows that had been cleaned by Liar's careful hands, she allowed herself to feel the sting of it. Some wounds never fully healed. They only learned to bleed more quietly, but sitting there watching the gentle rise and fall of the baby's breathing, Clare felt something else alongside the pain, a fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. These people could say what they wanted about her choices, her character, her prospects, but they would not be allowed to damage Matty's chances at happiness, and they would not drive her away from a child who needed her, no matter how much. Their judgment cost. Night was when the boundaries blurred, when the careful protocols they maintained during daylight hours gave way to something more intimate and dangerous. In the soft darkness of the house, with Mattier's needs creating their own urgent timeline that superseded social convention, Clare and Coulter moved around each other like dancers, learning a complicated routine by instinct rather than instruction. The baby's schedule recognized no distinction between proper and improper, appropriate and scandalous. When she cried at 2:04 in the morning, she needed comfort regardless of who provided it, or what the town might think about a single woman and a widowed man sharing the night watch. So they learned to navigate the darkness together, Clare appearing in the kitchen in her wrapper and bare feet to warm milk, while Coulter changed tiny nightclothes by lamplight, their paths crossing in the narrow space between the stove and the table with a naturalness that would have shocked anyone who believed. Geography could enforce morality. He would appear as she measured careful spoonfuls of sugar into the bottle, his hair mused from sleep, wearing only a shirt and trousers hastily pulled on over his underclothes. She would pass him in the hallway carrying the fussing baby, catching the scent of soap and something indefinably masculine that made her conscious of her own bare feet on the wooden floor, of the way her nightgown moved around her legs, of all the intimate details of living that daylight allowed them to ignore. They spoke little during these nocturnal encounters, but silence carried its own language, the careful way he made space for her at the counter when they both needed to use the sink, the soft sound of her humming when she thought he was asleep, melody lines that seemed to soothe Matty even when nothing else would, the moment when their fingers brushed as they both reached for the baby at the same time, and neither pulled away immediately, as if they were both reluctant to break a connection that felt necessary despite its impropriety. It was on such a night, with the baby finally settled after a particularly difficult evening of inconsolable crying, that Claire found him sitting at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of coffee gone cold. The lamp burned low between them, casting shadows that made the familiar room feel like a different place entirely, more intimate, more isolated from the world's judgment, more like the kind of space where true conversations might finally become possible. "You should sleep," she said softly, pulling her wrapper more closely around herself as she moved to bank the fire for the night. "Should?" He looked up at her, and in the lamplight, his face seemed younger, more vulnerable, stripped of the careful control he maintained during daylight hours. "Lots of things I should do. Sleep, eat regular meals, find a proper nanny for Matty instead of—" He gestured helplessly, unable to finish the sentence. Instead of what? Claire poured herself tea from the pot that never seemed to empty completely, that was refreshed throughout the day and night to meet their constant need for something warm and comforting. She sat across from him at the table, the wooden surface, creating a safe distance between them, even as the darkness pressed them into unwanted intimacy. Instead of depending on someone who has every reason to leave, his voice was rough with exhaustion and something deeper. Fear, perhaps, or the particular vulnerability that came from needing someone you couldn't quite trust. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwood trees with a sound like whispered secrets, like all the conversations they couldn't have in daylight. Claire wrapped her hands around her cup, feeling the warmth seep through the ceramic into her palms. The house creaked around them, settling into its night rhythms, and somewhere in the distance an owl called with the kind of loneliness that made the darkness feel vast and full of possibility. "She used to get up with me," he said suddenly, his voice so soft she had to lean forward to hear it. Liar even when she was exhausted, even when the pregnancy was hard on her and standing up made her dizzy, she said it was easier together, that sharing the hard parts made them less hard somehow. Claire set down her cup carefully, feeling the weight of his trust in sharing this memory, this glimpse into the marriage she had observed from careful distance. "Tell me about her at the end. I mean, what was she like when she knew Matty was coming?" His face changed, pain flickering across his features like candlelight across water. "She was scared, not of dying. She was stronger than that, braver than I ever was, but scared of leaving Matty, scared of leaving me to do it alone, to raise her daughter without her mother's guidance." He paused, his hands tightening around his cup. "She made me promise things, to tell Matty about her, to make sure she knew how much she was wanted, to find help if I needed it, to not let pride keep me from accepting support." "You're not alone now," Claire said, and the words hung between them heavier than she had intended, loaded with implications that made the space between them feel charged with possibility. She saw him stiffen slightly, saw the careful walls go up in his expression. "For now, but you'll leave, Claire. You always leave when things get complicated." The truth of it hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath with its accuracy. She had left before, left after the funeral when staying became too complicated, when the weight of what couldn't be said became unbearable, when watching him grieve for Liar made her own feelings feel like a betrayal of everything decent. She had built a life around leaving, around keeping her connections light enough to abandon when they grew too heavy or too dangerous to her carefully maintained independence. But sitting in Liar's kitchen, with Matty's soft breathing audible from the next room and the night pressing against the windows like something alive, Claire wondered if leaving was the only story she knew how to tell. Wondered if she had the courage to write a different ending, one that involved staying through the complicated parts, fighting for something instead of running from it. "Maybe this time is different," she said quietly. though even as she spoke the words, she wasn't sure she believed them. Coulter looked at her across the table, and in his eyes she saw hope struggling with the kind of caution that came from losing too much too quickly. "Maybe," he said finally, "but maybe isn't enough to build a life on." Clare's hands found their own rhythm in the garden behind the house, relearning the ancient language of soil and seed that connected her to every woman who had ever coaxed life from the earth. Leah had planted it with the same careful attention she brought to everything. Herbs near the kitchen window where they could be easily reached during cooking. Vegetables in neat rows that spoke of planning and hope for harvests that would feed a growing family. Flowers scattered throughout like small celebrations of beauty for its own sake. 3 weeks of neglect had left it overgrown but not defeated. The tomatoes hung heavy on their stakes, some splitting from overripeness. The beans had climbed their poles and begun to fall back down again, creating green curtains that moved in the morning breeze. Weeds had claimed space between the careful rows, but underneath their aggressive growth, the bones of Lyra's design remained visible, waiting for hands that remembered how to tend growing things. Clare worked in the early morning before Matty woke, her fingers slowly recovering skills she had learned at their mother's side and had thought lost to years of city living. The physical labor felt good after so much time spent in temporary places, never staying anywhere long enough to plant anything worth tending. There was something deeply satisfying about pulling weeds, about clearing space for plants that belonged, about the smell of earth that clung to her hands and reminded her of all the summers she had spent helping in this same plot of ground when she and Leah were girls. "You don't have to do that." Coulter's voice came from behind her, and she looked up to find him watching from the porch, coffee cup in hand, his expression unreadable in the early light. He was dressed for work, but not working, as if the routine of preparing for labor had become habit, even when there was no pressing need for it. "I know." She brushed dirt from her palms, leaving dark smudges on her skirt that would probably never come out completely, but it needs doing, and I like it. I like working with things that grow. He came down the steps slowly, as if approaching something skittish that might bolt if he moved too quickly. The morning air was cool, carrying the scent of impending autumn and the particular smell of earth that had been recently disturbed. Lyra loved this garden, spent hours out here, especially when she was carrying Matty. Said it helped her think, helped her imagine the future she was growing. "What did she think about?" Clare asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know. Lyra's thoughts, Lyra's dreams, Lyra's plans for a future that would never unfold. They were dangerous territory, loaded with implications and regrets that could derail the fragile peace they were building. The future, mostly, what kind of world she was bringing her daughter into, whether she'd be a good mother, whether she'd know how to teach Matty the things she needed to know. He paused, his gaze moving over the tidy rows. Clare had already restored the evidence of her morning's work. "Whether you'd ever come home." The word hung between them. Home. As if this place had ever truly belonged to her. As if her leaving hadn't been as much about not belonging as about what she couldn't have. Clare felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the old pain of being always somehow outside, always somehow not quite fitting the shapes that were available to her. "I thought about her too," she said quietly, not looking at him, focusing instead on the earth under her fingernails, the honest dirt that connected her to something larger than her own complicated emotions. Every day wondered what she was doing, how she was feeling, whether the baby was healthy. "But I couldn't come sooner." The words were gentle but unmistakable in their accusation. You couldn't come when she needed you. Clare felt the truth of it settle in her chest alongside all the other regrets she carried. "No, I couldn't, and I can't explain why in any way that would make sense to someone who's never been afraid of their own feelings." They stood together in the morning light, surrounded by the evidence of liars' planning, her hope for seasons she would never see. The silence stretched between them, heavy with all the words they couldn't say, all the explanations that would only make things more complicated. But underneath the discomfort was something else, a tentative sense of purpose, of hands that knew how to tend growing things, of a place that needed her presence, if only temporarily. "She planted the sunflowers for you," Coulter said finally, pointing to a corner of the garden where tall stalks raised their faces toward the eastern sky. Said they reminded her of you, always turning toward the light, always growing toward something better. Clare looked at the flowers, their golden, faces bright with morning sun, and felt something inside her chest crack open. Such a simple gesture, such a small kindness, but it spoke of a sister who had never stopped believing that someday Clare would find her way back to where she belonged. A sister who had planted hope in the earth and waited for it to bloom. "I don't know if I know how to stay," she said, the words coming out more vulnerable than she'd intended. "Maybe you don't have to know," Coulter replied. "Maybe you just have to try." The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried by the postal rider, who seemed uncomfortable delivering it as if he somehow sensed that its contents would disturb the fragile peace that had settled over the ranch. Clare recognized the handwriting. Before. She saw the return address, bold strokes that belonged to her cousin Margaret, who lived in Denver's finest neighborhood and had opinions about everything, particularly about the proper conduct of unmarried women who ought to know their place. Clare, the letter began without preamble, launching immediately into attack with the efficiency of someone who had clearly spent considerable time planning her assault. "Word has reached us about your current situation, and I must say I am deeply disturbed by what I have learned. While I understand the impulse to help family in their time of need, you must consider the impropriety of your arrangement. A single woman living with a widowed man, regardless of family connections, invites exactly the kind of gossip you have spent years cultivating. I am prepared to take the child if Coulter cannot manage alone. Children need stability, not the bore uncertainty of your unconventional choices." Clare read the letter twice, feeling her anger build with each word, each carefully chosen phrase designed to wound while maintaining the appearance of concern. Margaret, who had never wanted children of her own, who saw Matty as a problem to be solved rather than a life to be nurtured. Margaret, who had always viewed Clare's independence as a personal affront to the proper order of things, who couldn't understand why any woman would choose uncertainty over security, adventure over respectability. The letter continued with a catalogue of Clare's failures, her unmarried state, her lack of permanent address, her history of what Margaret termed unseemly wandering. Each accusation was presented as evidence of her unfitness to care for a child, her inability to provide the stability and respectability that Matty deserved. The final paragraph made Margaret's intentions clear. "If you persist in this inappropriate arrangement, I will have no choice but to petition the court for custody. I have consulted with my husband's legal associates, and they assure me that a respectable married woman with means would be viewed far more favorably than your current situation." She was still holding the letter when Coulter returned from town, Matty sleeping peacefully in his arms, her small face relaxed in the particular way of children who knew themselves to be safe and loved. The contrast between the innocence of the sleeping child and the threatening words on the paper made Clare's anger burn even hotter. "Bad news?" he asked, noting her expression, the way her hands trembled slightly as she held the letter. Clare handed him the letter without comment, watching his face change as he read. She could see the exact moment when he reached Margaret's. Threats could see his jaw tighten with anger, and something deeper, fear perhaps, or the particular horror of realizing that love might not be enough to protect what mattered most. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and handed it back to her. "Are you going to answer her?" "I don't know." Clare looked at Matty, at the way her small hand curled against Coulter's shirt in complete trust, and felt her heart break a little. "What she says of some of it is true. People are talking. The arrangement is unconventional, and She gestured helplessly at herself at the evidence of everything Margaret found objectionable. "I am exactly what she says I am." "And what's that?" Coulter's voice was quiet but intense, demanding honesty. "A woman with no husband, no permanent home, no conventional credentials for raising a child, a woman who disappears when things get difficult." Clare felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, frustrated by the truth of her own words. Maybe Margaret is right. Maybe Matty deserves better than gossip and speculation. Maybe she deserves the kind of respectable life I can't give her. Coulter was quiet for a long moment, his hand moving in slow circles on Matty's back, in the unconscious rhythm of someone who had learned to comfort without thinking about it. "What does she deserve, Clare? A loveless home where she's seen as a burden to be managed. A place where she's fed and clothed and educated, but never really known, or people who choose to care for her every day, even if those people don't fit someone else's idea of proper." The question settled between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to name. Clare looked around the kitchen at the evidence of their growing partnership, the way their routines had begun to mesh, the small comforts they had created together, the sense of purpose that had begun to grow in the spaces between Matty's needs and their care for her. "She's not just your responsibility," Coulter continued, his voice gentle but firm. "She's Liar's daughter, your blood, and Liar wanted you to be part of her life. She told me so more than once. She said if anything happened to her, she hoped you'd find your way back to family. Blood calls to blood." Clare remembered saying those words, remembered the way they had felt true in ways that went deeper than logic or social convention. But blood wasn't always enough, and good intentions couldn't shield a child from the sharp edges of social disapproval, from the kind of gossip that could follow someone through their entire life. Still, when she thought of Matty in Margaret's rigid household, surrounded by duty rather than love, raised by servants and tutors rather than people who delighted in her small discoveries, her chest tightened with something that felt like fierce protectiveness. "We should discuss this properly," she said finally, "when we both have time to think clearly, to consider all the implications." But even as she said it, Clare knew that some decisions lived in the heart rather than the head, and her heart had already begun to choose, regardless of what her mind told her about practicality and convention and the price of fighting for something the world didn't want her to have. They came on a Thursday afternoon, 3 women dressed in their best visiting clothes and carrying the authority of social convention like weapons they had been trained to use with precision. Mrs. Henderson led the group, her face set in lines, of righteous concern that had been practiced in church pews and ladies' circles until they appeared natural. Behind her came Mrs. Miller from the general store and Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed disapproval. The timing of their visit was clearly calculated. Afternoon, when respectable women would be making social calls, when the sun was bright enough to illuminate any evidence of impropriety, when Coulter might be expected to be working, and therefore unavailable to interfere with their mission. They had come to pass judgment, and they wanted to do it without male interference. Clare answered the door with flour on her hands, and Matty balanced on her hip, the picture of domestic normalcy that somehow made their arrival feel more ominous rather than less. She had been baking bread, something she hadn't done in years, but which had returned to her hands like muscle memory, and the kitchen behind her was warm with the smell of yeast and comfort. "Ladies," she said, her voice carefully neutral, offering no warmth but also no open hostility. "How may I help you? We've come to speak with you about your situation," Mrs. Henderson announced, her gaze taking in Claire's flour-dusted apron, the baby's content expression, the sound of Coulter's movement somewhere deeper in the house. Her tone suggested that situation was perhaps the politest word. She could manage for what she really thought about the arrangement. "I'm not sure what you mean." Clare shifted Matty to her other hip, feeling the child's solid weight as a source of strength and purpose. Matty was alert but calm, studying the strangers with the kind of frank curiosity that children brought to new faces. "Don't play innocent, girl." Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her voice sharp with the authority of someone who believed money and social position gave her the right to judge others. A single woman living in a man's house, caring for his child as if she had some right to do so. The whole town is talking about it. Clare felt Matty shift against her, responding to the tension in the air with the sensitivity children had for adult emotions. She adjusted her hold, one hand moving instinctively to support the baby's head, to create a barrier between her and the hostile energy radiating from the women on the porch. "Mr. Hart needed help with his daughter," she said quietly, keeping her voice level despite the anger beginning to build in her chest. "I was available to provide it. I see nothing scandalous in helping family during a difficult time." "For how long?" Mrs. Miller's question carried the weight of assumption, the suggestion that temporary help had already become something else entirely. How long before proper help becomes something else entirely? "You may not care about your own reputation. Clearly you don't, given the life you've chosen to live. But what about the child's?" The words hit their target with precision, finding the place where Clare's confidence was weakest. She had spent sleepless nights worrying about exactly this, how her presence might affect Matty's future, what doors might close to a child raised by people the town considered inappropriate, what whispers might follow her through school and courtship and all the important moments of her life. "The child is well cared for," she said quietly, though she could hear the defensiveness creeping into her voice despite her efforts to remain calm. "She's healthy, happy, surrounded by people who love her. That should be what matters." "What matters?" Mrs. Henderson replied, with the confidence of someone who had never questioned the rules she lived by, "is propriety, order. Children need stability, not the chaos that follows women like you." Women like you. Clare had heard variations of that phrase her entire life, from teachers who found her too curious, from suitors who found her too independent, from family members who found her too willing to choose her own path, regardless of social expectations. Each time it carved a little deeper, left her a little more isolated from the community she had never quite managed to join. But standing there with Matty, warm and trusting in her arms, with the smell of baking bread behind her and the evidence of careful domestic management all around them, Clare felt something shift inside her. These women had come to shame her, to drive her away in the name of protecting a child they barely knew and had never bothered to visit during the weeks when she was crying inconsolably and Coulter was falling apart from exhaustion. "I appreciate your concern for Matty's welfare," she said, her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. "But Mr. Hart is perfectly capable of making his own decisions about his household and his daughter's care." "Is he?" Mrs. Patterson's smile was sharp and knowing, the expression of someone who believed she understood male weakness better than men understood themselves. Or is he simply a grieving man being taken advantage of by a woman with nowhere else to go? A woman who sees an opportunity to secure herself a home and a husband, regardless of the damage to his reputation and his child's future. Before Clare could respond, Coulter appeared behind her, his presence solid and reassuring. She felt rather than saw him taking in the scene, the three women on his porch arranged like a tribunal, Clare's rigid posture the way Matty had begun, to fuss in response to the atmosphere of conflict that adults created and children always sensed. "Ladies," he said, his voice carefully polite, but carrying an undertone of steel that made all three women straighten slightly. "What brings you by on such a fine afternoon? We came to discuss Miss Alcott's influence in your home," Mrs. Henderson replied clearly, having prepared her words in advance. "There are concerns in the community about the propriety of the arrangement, about what kind of example is being set for the child." "I see." Coulter stepped closer to Clare, not quite touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the solid presence that suggested they were in this together, regardless of what the town thought. "And whose concerns are these specifically?" "The community's, people who care about you and your daughter, who want to see you both settled in a respectable situation. People who barely knew my wife when she was alive, you mean?" His voice remained level, but Clare could hear the steel underneath, the anger of a man who had been pushed too far. "People who didn't come to help when Matty was crying every night, and I was falling apart, when we needed support and understanding instead of judgment." The women exchanged glances, their mission clearly not proceeding as planned. Mrs. Patterson tried one more approach, her voice taking on the tone of someone offering wise counsel. "Think of your future, Mr. Hart. When you're ready to remarry, to give that child a proper mother, how will this situation appear to respectable women? What decent woman would want to join a household that's been the subject of gossip and speculation? If a woman can't accept that I choose my friends and household help based on their character and competence rather than gossip and social convention," Coulter replied with finality, "then she's not the kind of woman I'd want to marry or have as a mother to my daughter." The statement hung in the air like a challenge, clear and uncompromising. After a few more stiff pleasantries and veiled threats about community standards, the women departed, leaving Clare and Coulter standing together on the porch, watching their retreat down the drive. "Thank you," Clare said quietly, still holding Matty, who had calmed now that the tension was dissipating. "You don't need to thank me for telling the truth." He looked down at Matty, who had reached up to grab his finger with her small hand, and his expression softened. "Besides, they're wrong about what's proper. What's proper is what works for this family, what makes this child feel safe and loved." This family settled around Clare like a warm shawl, surprising in their comfort and their implication of belonging. For a moment, standing there with Coulter and Matty in the afternoon light, she allowed herself to imagine that it might be true, that family could be more than blood or law or social convention, that it could be simply what worked, what felt right, what grew out of choice and commitment rather than obligation. The letter from Margaret arrived 3 days later, more forceful than the first, clearly written by someone who had consulted lawyers and believed herself to be in a position to have strength. "I have spoken with several residents of your town." It began, the words practically vibrating with righteous anger. "And I am deeply concerned about the environment you are creating for that innocent child. The reports I have received paint a picture of scandal and impropriety that no respectable person could condone. If you persist in this inappropriate arrangement, I will have no choice but to petition the court for custody. Matty deserves better than to be raised by a woman of questionable character and a man too weak to see he is being manipulated." Clare read the letter in the garden where she had taken to escaping when the walls of the house felt too close, or when she needed the particular kind of peace that came from being surrounded by growing things. The morning light filtered through, the cottonwood leaves creating patterns that shifted with each breath of wind, and somewhere nearby a meadowlark called with the liquid joy that belonged to autumn mornings in Wyoming. Matty lay on a blanket nearby, watching the play of shadow and light with the fascination of someone seeing the world for the first time. She had learned to roll over recently, a development that filled both Clare and Coulter with disproportionate fright And now she demonstrated this skill repeatedly, as if delighted by her own competence. Every small milestone felt like a victory, evidence that they were doing something right, despite what the world thought about their unconventional arrangement. Bad news again. Coulter's voice came from behind her, and she turned to find him, approaching with 2 cups of coffee, his morning ritual of checking on the stock apparently completed. She handed him the letter, watching his jaw tighten as he read. The threats were more specific this time, the legal language more precise, and Clare could see him calculating odds and possibilities in the same way he might evaluate weather patterns or market prices. When he finished, he folded it deliberately and set it aside. "She can't take Matty," he said, but his voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. "I'm her father. No court would." "She can make things difficult," Clare interrupted, her voice quiet with acceptance of realities. She wished she could ignore. She has money, connections, social standing. And she gestured to herself, to the garden where she knelt in the dirt like someone who belonged to the earth rather than drawing rooms, to the evidence of all the ways she failed to meet society's expectations for women. "I have a history of disappointing people's expectations." Coulter was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between Clare and Matty, who had begun to make the soft sounds that meant she would soon want feeding. The baby's needs created their own timeline, indifferent to adult complications, and there was something reassuring about the way she demanded attention for purely biological reasons. "Tell me," he said finally, his voice careful in the way of someone approaching dangerous territory. "Why did you really leave after Lias's funeral? Why did you disappear without a word to anyone?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with years of unasked questions and unspoken truths. Clare felt her chest tighten, the familiar urge to deflect, to protect the tender places that couldn't bear too much light. But sitting here with Matty's presence anchoring her, and Coulter's eyes patient and waiting, she found herself speaking words she had never said aloud. "Because I loved you," she said simply, the words falling into the morning air like stones into still water. "Because I loved you, and you loved Lia, and there was no place in that story for what I felt. No way to stay that wouldn't have been. A betrayal of everything decent." The confession settled between them, like something fragile and dangerous. Clare kept her eyes on Matty, unable to look at Coulter's face, afraid of what she might see there. Pity, perhaps, or the polite discomfort of someone hearing more than they wanted to know. "I knew," he said quietly. Her eyes snapped to his face, shock making her forget her careful self-protection. "You knew. Not the extent of it, maybe, but I knew there was something. The way you looked at me sometimes when you thought no one was watching. The way you disappear when things got too intense between us. The way you avoided being alone with me, even when Lia was just in the next room." Clare felt heat rise in her cheeks, embarrassment mixing with a strange relief at finally having the truth spoken aloud. "Then you know why I had to leave, why I can't, why this arrangement can only be temporary." "No," he said, his voice surprisingly firm, carrying a conviction. That made her look at him more carefully. "I know why you thought you had to leave, but things are different now." "How?" The word came out sharper than she'd intended. Years of self-protection making her defensive even when she wanted to hope. "How are they different? You're still grieving the woman you loved, and I'm still the woman who loved her husband. Nothing has changed except that she's gone, and that makes it worse, not better." He was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. Matty began to fuss, and Clare gathered her up automatically, using the familiar motions of comfort to steady herself while she waited for him to speak. "Because grief changes everything," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. he rarely allowed himself to show, including what we think we deserve, what we think is possible, because that baby needs you. And maybe I do, too. The words hung between them, honest and vulnerable, and terrifying in their implications. Clare looked down at Matty, who had settled against her chest with the trust that came from repetition, from days and nights of being cared for by the same hands, and felt something inside her chest crack open. Margaret could still cause problems, she said, clinging to practical concerns because emotions felt too dangerous, too likely to lead her somewhere she couldn't return from. Let her try. Coulter's voice carried a determination she hadn't heard before, the sound of a man who had found something worth fighting for. We'll face whatever comes together. Together. The word carried weight, promise, possibility. Clare felt something inside her chest loosen, a knot of fear and longing that had been there so long, she had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. The decision, when it came, arrived dressed as an ordinary morning that felt touched by something extraordinary. Clare woke to the sound of Matty's hungry cries and found herself moving through the familiar routine with a sense of rightness that seemed to settle deeper into her bones with each passing day, warming milk, changing tiny clothes that smelled of baby sweetness and soap, settling into the rocking chair by the window, where the light was soft and the view included the garden she had been tending with increasing devotion. Coulter appeared in the doorway, hair mussed from sleep, but eyes already alert with the particular awareness that came from listening for a child's needs, even in sleep. He carried 2 cups of coffee, the morning ritual that had evolved between them without discussion, and set one on the table beside her before keeping the other, leaning against the doorframe with the easy comfort of someone who belonged exactly where he was. "Sleep well?" he asked, though they both knew that sleeping well was a relative concept when sharing a house with an infant. "Well enough." She adjusted Matty's position, smiling at the baby's enthusiastic response to breakfast. The way she attacked her bottle with the single-minded focus that babies brought to all their needs. She's getting stronger. Look how she holds her head up now, how she watches everything. They fell into the comfortable quiet that had become natural between them, punctuated only by Matty's contented sounds and the distant call of meadowlarks outside the window. The morning light was golden, the kind that made everything look touched by possibility, and Clare found herself memorizing the moment, the warmth of the baby in her arms, the steam rising from her coffee cup, the way morning light caught the planes of Cult's face and made him look younger, less burdened by all the ways life had disappointed him. "I've been thinking," she said finally, the words coming out stronger than she'd expected, carrying conviction she hadn't known she possessed, "about what you said yesterday, about facing things together." He straightened slightly, attention sharpening, in the way of someone who recognized an important moment when it arrived. And I want to stay." The declaration hung in the air between them, bold and final and somehow inevitable. "Not just until you find other help, not just until Margaret gets tired of threatening us. I want to stay and help raise Matty if you'll have me." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise, slow, warm, transforming everything she touched. It was the first truly unguarded expression she had seen from him since her arrival, and it made her realize how carefully he had been protecting himself, how much her answer meant to him. "Clare," he began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "I know it won't be easy," she continued, needing to say all of it before she lost her nerve. "People will talk. Margaret will fight us. There will be complications we can't even imagine yet. The town may never accept us, and there will always be people who think we're doing something wrong." She looked down at Matty, who had finished, eating, and was now studying Claire's face with the intense focus babies brought to the world. But this feels right. She feels right. This us, it feels like something worth fighting for. Coulter sat down his coffee cup and came to kneel beside the rocking chair, his hand covering hers where it rested on Matty's back. The gesture was gentle, but possessive, claiming her choice as something that belonged to both of them. "It won't be conventional," he said, but his voice held warmth rather than warning. "I've never been very good at conventional." Clare felt a fierce joy rising in her chest, bright and unexpected and liberating in ways she hadn't anticipated. Besides, Matty won't care what they think. She'll just know she's loved. "She is loved," Coulter said softly, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "By both of us, and that's going to have to be enough for anyone who has opinions about how we choose to live." Clare felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally choosing to stay, to fight, to claim her place in this small, imperfect family they were creating together. She had spent so many years running from complicated situations, avoiding anything that required too much emotional investment, that the simple act of choosing to remain felt revolutionary. "We should probably discuss practicalities," she said, trying to regain some composure, even as joy bubbled up inside her like spring water. "How we'll manage Margaret's objections, what we'll tell people about our arrangement, how we'll handle the legal complications later," Coulter said, his voice gentle but firm. "Right now, let's just sit with it, with choosing each other, with deciding that what we're building here matters more than what other people think about it." And so they did, the three of them caught in a pool of morning light, while outside the world continued its relentless turning, and the garden waited for tending, and the future stretched ahead of them, uncertain but no longer empty. For the first time in years, Clare felt herself settling into a moment that felt like home. Not the place where she was born, but the place where she had chosen to build something lasting and good. The summer passed in a rhythm of small victories and stubborn persistence, each day adding another layer to the foundation they were building together. Clare wrote to Margaret herself, a letter that was polite but uncompromising, carrying the authority of someone who had found something worth defending. "Matty is thriving here, surrounded by people who love her unconditionally and see her needs as the most important consideration in any decision we make. I understand your concerns, but they are not shared by those who know us best. I trust you, will respect our decision, and allow us to raise this child in peace." Margaret's response was swift and predictably furious, filled with threats of legal action and social ruin that arrived like summer thunder, loud, frightening, but ultimately ineffective against the solid structure of the life they were building. As the weeks passed and no lawyers appeared, no court documents arrived, Clare began to understand that her cousin's power lay mainly in intimidation rather than genuine authority. Empty threats from people who confused money with righteousness, social position with moral superiority. The town's resistance was more persistent, but also more manageable, requiring a different kind of strategy. Clare learned to navigate the careful politics of small communities, who to greet warmly, who to acknowledge with polite distance, which conversations to enter, and which to avoid entirely. She discovered that respectability could be earned through consistency, that people's opinions could be changed gradually if you gave them enough evidence that contradicted their assumptions. Mrs. Peterson, the minister's wife, was the first to soften. She stopped by one afternoon ostensibly to check on Matty's health, but clearly curious about their domestic arrangements, about whether the scandalous situation she had heard described matched the reality she could observe with her own eyes. Clare served tea in Lyre's best china, and let the woman see for herself. The clean house, the well-cared for baby, the obvious affection between all three of them, the simple domestic peace that radiated from every corner of their shared life. "The child seems content," Mrs. Peterson admitted, watching Matty play with a set of wooden blocks on the kitchen floor, babbling to herself in the complex language that babies invented and adults could never quite decipher. "She is," Clare replied, pouring tea with the grace their mother had taught her, proving that she could manage the social rituals when she chose to. "Children know when they're loved, when they're secure. She's never known anything but care and attention. And you and Mr. Hart, you're managing well together." It was delicately phrased, but Clare understood the real question underneath, whether they were living as man and wife, or maintaining the proprieties that would make their arrangement acceptable to people who cared about such things. "We are," Clare said simply. "We care about the same things. Matty's welfare, maintaining this house as a place where she can grow up feeling safe and valued, building something stable and good that will serve her throughout her life." Mrs. Peterson nodded slowly, and Clare could see her revising whatever assumptions she had brought with her, replacing gossip with observation, speculation with evidence. By the time she left, she was making tentative offers of help. A church, ladies' circle that might welcome Clare despite her unconventional status, a children's group where Matty could play with others her age when she was old enough. Similar encounters followed with other women in town, each one a small negotiation, a careful building of bridges that had been burned by assumption and gossip. Clare found herself developing a patience she hadn't known she possessed, understanding that acceptance would come slowly or not at all, but that the effort was worth making for Matty's sake. The child would grow up in this community, would need to find her place among these people, and every small victory in the battle for social acceptance was an investment in her future happiness. Coulter watched these delicate social maneuvers with a mixture of admiration and protective concern. "You don't have to win them all over," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch, Matty sleeping between them in the basket that had once held lyres sewing and now served as a portable bed for a child who belonged wherever they were. "No," Clare replied, watching the last light fade from the western sky, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. "But I want Matty to grow up somewhere she belongs, where she doesn't have to apologize for her family or feel ashamed of how she came to be loved." "She won't," Coulter said with quiet certainty, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had thought deeply about these questions. "She'll know her worth, because we know it, because we show her every day that she matters more than anything. Hell in the world, the rest will follow." Clare hoped he was right, but either way she was learning that love required not just feeling, but action, the daily choice to stay, to fight, to build something worth defending against whatever forces might try to tear it down. The package arrived in autumn, when the cottonwood leaves had turned to gold, and the air carried the promise of winter in its crisp edges. It bore no return address, only Clare's name written in a careful hand she didn't recognize, and the mysterious nature of its arrival made her handle it carefully, as if it might contain something dangerous or precious beyond measure. Inside, wrapped in soft cloth that smelled faintly of lavender and old roses, was a locket, antique gold, delicately engraved with patterns that spoke of expert craftsmanship and considerable expense. The metal was warm to the touch, as if it had been recently held by loving hands, and its weight suggested substance, permanence, the kind of heirloom that passed between generations of women who understood the importance of preserving memory. The note was brief but deeply moving in its simplicity, for Matty when she's old enough to understand, from someone who loved her mother and wants her to know where she came from. It was signed only with the initial L written in the same careful hand that had addressed the package, offering no clues about its sender's identity, but somehow conveying warmth and good intentions. Clare stared at the locket for a long time, turning it over in her hands, feeling the weight of gold and memory that seemed to pulse with its own life. When she finally opened it, she found a tiny photograph of Lyre on one side, cut from a larger portrait with loving precision, showing her sister at her most beautiful, laughing, radiant, alive with the particular joy that had always been her defining characteristic. On the opposite side was empty space, waiting for another photograph, another memory to complete the story the locket was meant to tell. "What is it?" Coulter asked, finding her standing motionless in the kitchen, the locket cupped in her palms like something that might take flight if she didn't hold it carefully. She showed him the locket, watched his face change as he recognized Lyre's image captured in golden glass. The pain that flickered across his features was immediate and complex. Grief, yes, but also something softer, a kind of wondering gratitude that someone had taken such care to preserve this piece of their shared past. "Do you know who sent it?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. Clare shook her head, but something about the careful anonymity felt familiar, like a gesture she had seen before from someone who understood that love didn't always come with the right to claim credit for its expressions. Someone who understands that gifts like this are about the recipient, not the giver. Someone who knew Lyre well enough to choose exactly the right thing. They sat together at the kitchen table, the locket between them like a small golden bridge spanning the space between past and future. Matty crawled between their chairs, pulling herself up to standing, using Coulter's knee for support, her small face bright with the triumph of newly mastered balance. She was growing so quickly now, changing almost daily, and Clare felt the familiar urgency that came from knowing how fleeting these moments were, how quickly children moved from one stage to the next. "We should put it away," Clare said, though her hands seemed reluctant to close the locket to hide Lyre's face again. "Until she's older, until she can understand what it means." But as she reached for the locket, Coulter caught her hand gently. "Wait, look at the other side again." Clare opened it, seeing the empty space that waited for another photograph, another piece of the story. "What about it?" "It's for you," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that came from deep understanding. "Your picture should go there. So when she's old enough to understand, she'll see both the women who loved her, both the mothers who helped shape who she became." The suggestion hit Clare like a physical force, unexpected and overwhelming in its implications. To be included in something so permanent, so precious, to have her place acknowledged, not just in Matty's present, but in the story that would be told about her origins, her heritage, the women who had contributed to making her who she was. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice caught between longing and fear. "It feels like claiming something that wasn't meant for me." "Lyre was her mother. I'm just your what?" Coulter's voice was gentle but insistent, demanding honesty from both of them. The woman who's loved her every day since you arrived, the woman who gets up with her in the night, who knows exactly how she likes to be held when she's fussy, who lights up every time she learns something new. You're not just anything, Clare. You're her family. Clare looked at the locket again, at Lyre's face, smiling up from the tiny photograph, and felt something shift inside her chest. Perhaps love wasn't about blood alone or legal claims or social conventions that defined who had the right to call themselves family. Perhaps it was about the daily choice to stay, to care, to nurture someone into the fullness of themselves, regardless of what the world thought about the arrangement. "We'll ask Mrs. Peterson to take our photograph," she said finally, her voice growing stronger with each word. "The three of us together, and then we'll put mine in the locket, so Matty will always know that she belonged to all of us." "Coulter," smiled, and the expression transformed his whole face, making him look younger and lighter, as if a burden he hadn't even realized he was carrying had suddenly been lifted. Clare would like that. She always said family was about more than who you were born to, that it was about who chose to love you and keep loving you no matter what. As if summoned by her mother's name, Matty looked up at them both, her small hand reaching toward the locket that caught the afternoon light and threw it back in golden fragments. Clare lifted her up, feeling the solid weight of her, the trust implicit in the way the child melted against her shoulder, and knew with absolute certainty that this was where she belonged. Yes, she murmured into Matty's soft hair, breathing in the sweet scent that belonged uniquely to her. You're going to know you belong to all of us, that love makes families just as much as blood does. Winter arrived gently that year with snow that fell like benediction over the valley, transforming the familiar landscape into something magical and new. Clare stood at the kitchen window, watching Coulter clear a path to the barn while Matty played at her feet, stacking wooden blocks with the intense concentration she brought to everything, her small tongue poking out slightly as she focused on the complex engineering required to make one block balance on another. The house had settled into its new configuration around them, like clothing that had been worn long enough to become comfortable. Their rhythms were woven together so naturally that Clare sometimes forgot there had been a time before this. Before, the three of them had learned to move through their days like parts of a well-oiled machine that existed for no purpose, except their mutual care and comfort. Evidence of their merged lives was everywhere now. Coulter's clothes hanging next to hers on the line behind the house, his large shirts and work pants making her dresses look small and feminine by comparison. Her books sat on his shelves, their spines adding color and variety to what had been a collection focused entirely on farming and animal husbandry. Matty's toys were scattered through every room, evidence of a child who belonged everywhere she went, who had claimed the entire house as her territory. The photograph had been taken 2 weeks ago. The three of them posed stiffly at first in the photographer's studio until Matty had grabbed for Clare's nose and made them all laugh, breaking the formal tension and creating something real and joyful. The resulting image captured something true, the easy affection between them, the way they naturally arranged themselves around the child at their center, the unmistakable evidence that they were exactly what they appeared to be, a family. Clare had placed the small copy in the locket just yesterday, her picture joining Liar's in the circle of gold that would someday hang around Matty's neck. Looking at them together, two women who loved the same child, who had each in their own, helped bring her into being, Clare felt a peace she hadn't known was possible. There was something deeply right about the pairing, about the way their faces complemented each other in the small space, suggesting continuity and love that transcended the conventional boundaries of family. The roads might be impassable for a few days, Coulter said, stamping snow from his boots as he came inside, bringing with him the scent of cold air and pine, and the particular freshness that belonged to winter mornings. Good thing we stocked up on supplies last week. Good thing, indeed. Clare lifted Matty up, settling her on her hip with the automatic ease that had developed over months of practice. Though I can't think of anywhere I'd rather be snowed in. It was true, and the truth of it still surprised her sometimes. This house, this life they had built together from grief and hope and stubborn love. It felt like the place she had been trying to reach her entire adult life without ever knowing what she was looking for. Not perfect, not conventional, not anything she could have planned or predicted, but utterly completely theirs in ways that mattered more than social approval or legal recognition. Kohler came to stand beside them at the window, his arms settling around Clare's shoulders with the naturalness of long practice. the gesture so familiar now that she couldn't remember when she had stopped being surprised by it. They watched the snow fall together, three people who had found each other through loss and chosen to stay through everything that followed. The scene outside was beautiful in the way that only winter could be. Everything simplified, softened, made clean, and new by the falling snow. The garden lay sleeping under its white blanket, but Clare could see the bones of what they had built there, the careful structure that would wake again in spring. Like everything else they had created, it was patient, enduring, built to last through seasons of difficulty and change. "What are you thinking about?" Coulter asked, his voice soft enough not to disturb the peaceful mood that had settled over them like the snow outside. "Beginnings," Clare said, watching a cardinal land on the fence post outside, its red feathers bright against the white background. "How they can look like endings at first, how sometimes you have to lose one story to find the one you were really meant to live." Matty babbled something in her own language, reaching toward the window where snowflakes caught the light like falling stars, and both adults smiled at her enthusiasm for this new wonder. Everything was new to her still. Every experience a discovery, and there was something infectious about her delight in the world's small miracles. "Do you think she'll understand?" Coulter asked, his voice carrying the particular weight that came from thinking about the future, about the stories they would tell and the explanations they would give when questions became more complex than they were now. When she's older, when she asks about how we all came together, about why our family looks different from other families. Clare considered this, watching Matty's fascination with the falling snow, the way she tried to catch the flakes that weren't there, reaching for beauty just beyond her grasp. "I think she'll understand that love makes families, not law or blood or convention. I think she'll understand that sometimes the most important thing you can do is choose to stay, choose to build something good, even when the world doesn't approve of your methods." They stood there as the afternoon light faded and the snow continued to fall, marking the boundaries of their small kingdom with white. Clare felt the weight of the compass at her throat. Liar's gift, liar's blessing, and understood finally that some journeys end exactly where they were meant to begin. The compass had brought her home, but home wasn't a place on any map. It was this moment, this choice, this daily decision to love and be loved in return. Behind them, the house settled into evening rhythms that felt as natural as breathing. The fire crackled in the hearth, waiting to warm them through the night. Dinner waited to be prepared with hands that knew each other's rhythms, voices that had learned to harmonize around the needs of someone small and precious. 1,000 small domestic tasks stretched ahead of them, ordinary and precious, and utterly their own. Clare closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of snow and woods, and the particular sweetness that belonged to Matty's hair. When she opened them again, the world was still there, still theirs, still waiting, still full of the kind of love that transforms everything it touches. Outside, the snow fell like hope made visible, covering everything in possibility, promising that tomorrow would be different and better, and exactly what they made of it together.